Part 3. The Exercises of the Moderns. Quoting John Amos Comenius, A Reformation of Schools, 1642. For indeed, this is the time above all ages that are past both to hope and to attempt greater things. Prospect. The Re-Secularization of the Withdrawn Subject. On the power of the slogan. To hope and to attempt greater things. One of the strengths of the modern world is that it was never at a loss when it came to proclaiming slogans through the mouths of its protagonists by which participants in excessive crusades could identify one another. Now, 200 years later, what the Florentine goldsmith and humanist Lorenzo Ghiberti said to his co-conspirators in the early 15th century, at the start of their argonautical journey to the shores of universal art, quote, "Men can do all things if they will," end quote, has almost become self-evident to the artistic and technical virtuosos, the modern people of skill and entrepreneurs of their own lives, as well as the increasingly numerous prefects for the life of the others. Despite all periodically recurring cycles of historical discouragement and calls for self-reduction, the proud motto of the modern age would never be entirely forgotten. Even the Soviet educators from the time of change around 1920 still repeated this revolutionary optimistic thesis in every register, though perhaps adding the qualification that, aside from the resolute will to act, the social conditions must also be given. The great Comenius, 1592 to 1670, founder of Baroque pedagogy and idea provider for the construction of modern large-scale learning machines, knew what it meant to undertake greater things after so many wasted centuries. Grace is great, but technology applied to man is even greater, and election takes us a certain distance, but the new art of education takes us further. Where there had been the exception, there would now be the rule. Now was the time to apply the letterpress to young souls and print annual volumes of students who would emerge like prize specimens from the erratum-free human publishing house. It was no coincidence that the visionary educator spoke of his school project as a typographeum vivum, a live typesetting apparatus that would populate the world with masterpieces of human print. He thus presented an idea that could be newly acknowledged by the media theorists of the late 20th century. Even these would speak less of the subject being printed in a press than of its mental formatting. The early 20th century revealed its concerns when Leon Trotsky lectured in the style of the enthusing hardware ideologue. Quote, "Once he is done with the anarchic forces of his own society, man will set to work on himself, in the pestle and retort of the chemist. For the first time mankind will regard himself as raw material, or at best as a physical and psychic semi-finished product." End quote. According to the revolutionary cult of science, completion could only take place in the mints of the new human being, when the Soviet state was planning to create. The periods after Trotsky showed that work on the human being continued in quite different treatment centres. The semi-finished product man has its dangers that resist reprocessing, whether into educated man, the overman, or the new human being. But at least since the end of the Second World War, the news has been all over town. Quote, "Man has reached the point of treating the human race as material." End quote. The new zeitgeist. Experiment with humans. The path to the age of production, which culminated in the production of the producer, began long before the 20th century. Whenever there was progress along this route, it was announced with great pomp that humans were becoming accessible to themselves. It seems that the effective centre of modern currentness consists in continuous reports on the growth of the radius of human availability to oneself and one's kind. Such novelties have always, below the level of general rejection stemming from their potentially disturbing nature, evoked affirmative and negative passions. Indeed, the appearance of anything truly new on this front was followed by apocalyptic declarations, most recently around the year 2000, when the decoding of the human genome was imminent. Tempus est, Comenius wrote on the wall in fiery letters in 1639. It is time. This formula continues to determine agendas for the futurized world to this day. The most pressing item on these agendas is the systematic production of human beings who meet the highest standards of anthropomorphism. We are speaking of the 17th century in Europe, when the zeitgeists of change were becoming strong, though the word zeitgeist only entered the modern German vocabulary around 1800. Anthropomorphism. At the time, this still meant the unimpaired image of God. For the passionate reformatory theologian, it encompassed universal knowledge of the three great books of being: nature, the human soul, and the human scripture. Humanity was now to go into serial production in order to populate every area of this continent, and later the planet, with individuals at the level of the humanly possible. Patience with the old inadequacies had come to an end. It was time for humans to cease being an outgrowth of moral coincidence. We, the meanwhile impatient self-sculptors and man-sculptors of the technological centuries, could no longer wait until some individual deigned to break with their conventional existence and create a heightened exemplary life through metanoia, asceticism, and study. In future, the young creatures in the human gardens of the Baroque state would be cultivated on high trellises to become well-formed specimens of their kind. The new educators believed that they knew how to overhaul each individual's coincidental weariness of their previous life. The whole system of moulding humans was arranged metanoetically. Indeed, the basic order of the pedagogical province itself bespeaks the impulse to preempt the late remorse of individuals through the early training of all. This anthropogogics reveals a naive perfectionism whose élan still fed the later Enlightenment. Here discipline is aligned with the quest for perfection, duty with voluntary agreement, and study with inner surplus. It is only a secondary concern to reflect on the necessity of facing the wilder outgrowths of humanity with the means of guarding and punishing. It is high time to clear up a misunderstanding to which Foucault contributed. It is not in the prisons and places of oppressive supervision, but in the frequently strict schools and academies of the modern age, along with the craftsmen's workshops and artists' studios, that the main human orthopedics of modernity is carried out. That is to say, the moulding of the young by the standards of Christian humanist discipline. The real aim of the departure to the age of arts and technologies was to train ever new generations of virtuosos. Certainly the disciplinary imperative shows its second face in the heterotopic background inhabited by the droves of infamous humans. In the age of absolutist population politics, they inevitably constitute a massive group. And this face must be mentioned by anyone seeking to reconstruct the birth of the prison from the spirit of responsibility for the human surplus. It would be absurd, however, to reduce the concept of disciplining in general to the penitentiary, repressive and surveillance state meanings on which Foucault placed such deliberately exaggerated emphasis in the writings of his middle period. Anyone wishing to acquaint themselves with all phases of the production of the new human being, at any rate, must probe as far back as the 17th century, even to the turbulence of the Reformation, and further still to their preludes in late medieval mysticism. Whoever wanted, like the young Gorky, clearly under Nietzsche's influence, to write man in capital letters, almost unknowingly joined a tradition that had begun with the recruits of Christ in the Egyptian desert monasteries, and the Pauline communities in Greece and Asia Minor, whose pneumatic aggregations through which the Holy Spirit, supported by the exercises and crucifixion of the flesh, was meant to bring about a new creation. The early Christians began to transform their whole lives into experiments in order to resemble the God-man Nos autem in experimentus volvemur, Augustine writes in his Confessions. Only God always remains identical to himself, whereas we are tossed from trial to trial. Modern humans augmented the ascetic experimentalism of the ancients with technical and artistic, then finally political experimentalism. The task they set themselves in all seriousness was to rewrite the text of the human condition, partly with updated Christian humanist procedures, partly following the guidelines of post-Christian and post-humanist schemes of existence. The essay and the experiment are not merely literary and scientific procedures. They shaped modernity's style of existence as a whole, and after 1789, also that of major politics and the national and global economy. An experimenter is someone who takes a chance every time, convinced that the new is always right. Needless to say, the American President Theodore Roosevelt placed himself in the same tradition when he invoked the great work of uplifting mankind in 1899, exchanging the Christian world mission for civilizatory messianism. Modern unrest. The beginnings of the turn towards greater things were already several centuries in the past when Comenius launched the campaign of universal education, Pan Paideia, in response to the apocalyptically interpreted confusion of the 30 Years' War. In the human zoo of the burgeoning modern age, the Black Death of 1348 had been followed by an unrest that would never be calmed. There has been much speculation as to the origins of the new Zeitgeist and Weltgeist. Some sought to locate them in the mysticism of northwest European towns, or in the early capitalist economy. Connections have been posited with the development of the clockwork mechanism, or with double-entry bookkeeping of the Venetians, propagated by the Franciscan priest Luca Pacioli in his 1494 book on arithmetic, which was read throughout Europe. The Faustian soul was taken as the metaphysical source of modern restlessness, while Dr. Faustus, that man of infinite skills and, quote, far-famed sorcerer and master of the black art, end quote, who pawned his soul for the sake of heightened self-enjoyment, was conversely declared the personification of credit, that fifth essence which grips honest debtors to the marrow and drives them over land and sea in ever-expanding trajectories. Modern unrest was also attributed to the shock of spatial expansion resulting from Atlantic seafaring and the discovery of the New World, as if the global mobility of the floating capital on the oceans had reproduced itself in the attitude towards life in the most obscure mainland towns. Quote, "The primary fact of the modern age is not that the earth revolves around the sun, but that money flows around the earth." End quote. In the following I will show that the specifically modern unrest in the field of shaping humans, which in its most recent offshoots is still and more than ever ours, stems most of all from endogenous, that is to say, practice historically, or ascetologically relevant sources. Looking back on the programs and workshops of the practicing life in the pre-modern world, it becomes clear. The realization among Marx and the young Hegelians that man produces man can only be understood in all its ramifications if one looks behind the word produce, which was borrowed one-sidedly from the modern working world and its industrial procedures, and also perceives the universe of practicing behaviour, training, and routines of conscious and unconscious keeping in shape, among which, ironically enough, one must also include the phenomenon of getting out of shape through the wrong training, and exercises in neglect. This concession seems more acceptable in the case of athletes and monks than farmers, factory workers, or handymen. Nonetheless, even the most intense activities of a working type constitute one of the many masks of the practicing life. Whoever lifts it sees through the mystifications of the productivistic era and sees the omnipresence of the practice aspect amidst work phenomena. Then it becomes demonstrable, down to the smallest detail, how the active mould themselves through regularly repeated activities. It is necessary to understand why and through what repercussions on his own existence man can effectively be considered the producer of man. Autoplastic action, circulus virtuosus. The basic information about the production of humans through humans is made explicit via study of the vita activa. The pragmatists of the 19th century realized this. By studying the act of life, they uncovered the basic anthropotechnic laws, the repercussions of all actions and movements on the actor. Working places the worker in the world and marks them with the stamp of their own acts by the short route of a practicing self-shaping. No activity evades the principle of retroactive influence on the operator, and whatever reacts to earlier events also affects later ones. The act produces the actor, the reflection the reflected, the emotion the feeler, and the test of conscience the conscience itself. Habits shape the virtue and vices, and complexes of habits form cultures. The European seafarers who circumnavigate the world are still discovering peoples with their own ways of life, some of them bizarre, on the most distant islands. The anthropologists on board recognize the power of practice systems in the local customs and describe these autoplastic rules of human shaping, an analogy to corresponding European phenomena, and for want of a better term as religious rituals. The practicing life is not limited to a simple reproduction of actors by their actions, however. All expansions of ability circles, all increases extended to the furthest caves of artistry, take place on the basis of self-shaping through practice. The mystery of why achievements tend towards growth under certain circumstances has not been fully solved to this day. For some forms of ascending spirals, however, more precise descriptions are available. In the field of physical strength increase, for example, the explicit description of the supercompensation mechanism in modern sport physiology has brought about a far-reaching expansion of understanding. The newer sciences of training have been able to show in detail how, after heavy strains, the muscular apparatus can restore its strength to a level higher than its original fitness status, assuming it is granted the necessary recovery time. The rhythms of regeneration hold the secret of the overexertion that leads to higher performance levels. This phenomenon has been intuitively comprehensible since time immemorial, and had already been exploited for intensive training sessions in antiquity. Now, on the other hand, the ancients were also familiar with the phenomena of overtraining that appear if regeneration rhythms are disregarded. With increases in mental and fine motor performance, supercompensation is augmented by a form of superadaptation. This ensures that nervous and kinetic systems accommodate certain regular stimulations through a form of preemptive willingness to execute. Thus even highly improbable movements such as prestissimo, runs on the piano, or a conjurer's tricks. Prestidigitator literally means fast fingerer, can be imprinted on the bodily memory and stabilized as a virtuosic habitus. Here it is the anticipatory intelligence in particular that is stimulated. Recent research in the fields of learning theory, neuromotorics, neurorhetoric, and neuroaesthetics consolidate and vary didactic intuitions that originate in early asceticisms and artistries. All somewhat advanced civilizations make use of the observation that every active person is dyed in the lie of their activities until the miracle of second nature takes place and they perform the near impossible almost effortlessly. The high theorem of explicit training theories, then, is that ability subjected to persistent furthering tensions produces, almost of its own accord, heightened ability. Through exact descriptions of the circulus virtuosus, it becomes explicable how accomplishment leads to higher accomplishment, and success to expanded success. The Jesuit axiom, everyone who has will be given more. Everyone who has will be given more, is not evidence of early Galilean capitalism, but rather one of the oldest formulations of the circle of success, also known in sociology as the Matthew effect. Whoever is able will be granted more ability. It is not without reason that successful people from the most diverse fields believe they can learn from one another at a distance. They intuit that virtuosos from all kinds of disciplines emerge from comparable circles of increase. They see humans standing at the crossroads, which all forms of positive feedback must pass. Together they thus become carriers of able virtue, which is often only a short distance away from giving virtue. This observation creates the possibility of affirming the medieval doctrine of the connexio virtutum on a modern foundation. Everyday intuitions already tell us that non-leisure is the beginning of virtue. Conversely, Christian monks recognized lethargy as the mother of despair, accompanied by its other unattractive daughters, digression, verboseness, aimless curiosity, lack of restraint, and inconstancy. It is the daily line of writing that forms the artist, the daily self-denial that forms the ascetic, the daily encounter with the power needs of other humans that forms the diplomat, and the daily joy at the willingness of children to be stimulated that forms the teacher. Anyone who subjects themselves to rituals and regularities develops nolens volens into their representative. What is the carrier of culture if not a guardian of repetition? Just as practice makes perfect, training makes the subject, provided that we understood subjectivity in the light of the general theory of practice as the carrier of its activity sequences, the apprentice of trainable modules, and the holder of its habitual acquisitions, without having to deny the relative validity of the usual interpretation of subjectivity as the epicenter of expression, reflexivity, and innovation. As soon as one realizes how every gesture carried out shapes its performer and determines the future state from the second occurrence on, one also knows why there is no such thing as a meaningless movement. Repetition lost its innocence in the anthropological enlightenment. As people now explicitly understood, the continuance of the world depends on it, which does not say anything against the unique, except that we abuse it by dancing around the golden calf of the event. It is in the nature of natures to be systems of repetition for the established, and this applies almost equally to cultures. God himself has to carry out most things via the routines of nature, and can only occasionally make use of his ontological secret weapon, the miracle. Kierkegaard was already speaking from the perspective of modern reflexive knowledge when he stated, quote, "If God himself had not willed repetition, there would never have been a world. This is the reason there is a world. The world consists of repetition. Repetition is actuality and the earnestness of existence." End quote. Nietzsche adds to this what he learned through long experiments on himself. Style is indeed man himself, provided one is aware that style is a cultural manifestation of repetition. Anyone with style will even see happiness as the good habit of being happy. Even genius is simply a group of good habits whose collision makes sparks fly. In order to uncover the matrix of old and new European techniques for shaping humans, one must first examine the training centres scattered across the whole continent, in which those who practice with Christ prepare for the highest agonies. Brought into shape by their abbots, pastors, saints, and learned mentors, and those who have been called professors since the 16th century were initially no more than trainers at schools of transfiguration. And those later termed students were first of all seekers in whom the eros of impossibility was at work, morder academico. They yielded willingly to the illusion that is indispensable for all advanced civilizations, that the inimitable is imitable, and the incomparable repeatable. As soon as the utmost ambition had taken root within them, they came under the spell of the paradox without whose constant reenactment no culture can securely fix its upper pole. For them, therefore, "you must change your life" meant nothing other than a call to follow the godly or God-manly models, under whose influence the boundaries between the possible and the impossible are blurred. With the advent of modern times, the absolute imperative changed the direction of its impact. In future it would be, You must act at all times in such a way that within your person you anticipate the better world in the worse. It will not be long before the meaning of this directive is twisted into an instruction for external application. You must change the world so that, if it is reshaped in the correct sense, you can adapt to it with a clear conscience. Modernity is the time in which those humans who hear the call to change no longer know where they should start, with the world or with themselves, or with both at once. The discovery of the world in humans. The forms of unrest that began to manifest themselves in the 14th century stem primarily from the surpluses of subject energy that were bred in the 1,000-year empire of withdrawals from this world, Morde Philosophico and Morde Christiano. One could almost speak of an original accumulation of capital, comprising concentrations, intensities, and readiness to act that one day had to look for suitable forms of investment. The centuries following the Black Death in Europe, in fact, belonged to an unprecedentedly novel economy in which new means of practice, machines, tools, media, and funds, brought about new circumstances of practice. First of all, schools and more schools, then artists' studios, theatres, concert halls, barracks, factories, clinics, prisons, speakers' pulpits, markets, places of assembly, stadiums, and sports studios. What began in the modern age was no less than a new form of large-scale anthropotechnic regime, a fundamentally changed battle formation of disciplines. Need we repeat that it was Foucault whose studies on the history of modern disciplinary procedures, which had no models to speak of, sensitized us to this previously almost unnoticed field? The decisive changes primarily concern the traditional division in the world of the practicing life, which I call the ontological local government reorganization. In the course of this process, the practicing of antiquity, the adepts of the philosophical modus vivendi, and later the monks, the penitential warriors and athletes of Christ, had withdrawn from worldly matters in order to devote themselves exclusively to what each viewed as, quote-unquote, their own. Their whole existence revolved around the concern for their own ability to remain intact in the midst of the ominous century. Their aim was no less than the final immunization of their own lives in the face of the constant threat of injuries and ubiquitous distractions. Suum tantum curari had been the salvific formula for the era of self-discovery and retreat from the world, applying to both philosophical and religioid life plans. One cannot remotely claim that the modern age disabled the worldiverse and radically metanoetic forms of religiously or philosophically coded cura sui overnight. Nothing would be more deluded than to believe that in early modernity the escapists of yesterday suddenly turned into new worldlings who regretted their gloomy absences. The legend of the modern individual's suddenly recovered affirmation of the world and life should be approached with suspicion. More than a few sound thinkers of the modern age place their lives programmatically under the sign of Saturn, the planet of distance from the world. The homines novi, who entered the stage in the 14th century, the early virtuoso era, were not runaway monks who had abruptly embraced the joys of the extroverted life, as if they wanted to erase the memory of their 1,000-year recession like some regrettable episode. They normally clung doggedly to their ontological exile, indeed claimed more than ever a noble exterritoriality in relation to impoverished ordinariness. Even an exemplar new human like Petrarch, one of the first moderns to wear a poet's crown, the emblem of a new type of aristocracy, had very strong personal reasons to hide in his refuge in the Vaucluse for so many years, searching for a non-monastic form of vita solitaria. Where else could he shelter his noble sickness, the world hatred of the man of black-galled constitution, to evil discovered and fought by the abbots in the Egyptian desert under the name Acadia, if not in his study cell, far from vulgar concerns. For the early moderns, devotion to the spiritual sphere still assumed a refusal to participate in profane affairs, and yet they, the proto-virtuosos, vacillating between the older monks' cells and the newer studios of the humanists, found themselves drawn into a heightened learning dynamic. They were pulled along by a drift towards self-intensification that only formed a contradictory unity with conventional monastic de-selfing courses. This intensification resulted in tendencies towards a restricted new participation of spiritual persons in the world. Using a term coined by the neo-phenomenologist Hermann Schmitz, albeit in a modified fashion, I call this return a re-embedding of the excluded subject. The first embedding enables individuals to participate directly in their situations. Through re-embedding, they find their way back to these after phases of estrangement. Whoever affirms an immersion in the situation is on the way to becoming what Goethe, referring to himself, occasionally called the worldling in the middle, das Weltkind in der Mitte. Nonetheless, even at the start of the modern age, the exiles of the practicing were chosen just as resolutely as in antiquity, when the ethical distinction began to take effect. How else can one explain the popularity of the icon of St. Jerome, which inspired countless variations on the joys of retreat in the early modern age? The scholar with the lion at his feet still testifies to the attraction of the contemplative life on the outskirts of the convivially transformed. In fact, a bourgeoisified desert, and in a turbulent time that one might think was knowledgeable about everything but deserts and refuges. But note, the escapism of the moderns was as urgently motivated as it was in the days of the early disgust at circumstances. It still gave hope to those without worldly hope, still offered those with no social prospects the prospect of an alternative existence. Nonetheless, the newer retreats often accumulated worldly meanings, with a value and a scope of their own, to the point where recessively excluded subjectivity, within its enclave of self-concern, emerged as a figure of the world in its own right. Now, from the starting point of a methodically sought unworldliness, a virtuoso industry blossomed. Its masters took themselves up as workpieces of the art of living, moulding themselves into humane valuables. When Nietzsche's confession in Ecce Homo, I took myself in hand, renders audible, as well as the autotherapeutic impulse of a chronically ill man, are overtones that recall the turn of the early moderns towards a transformation of themselves into living artificers. Perhaps the habit maketh not the monk, but study gets the scholar in shape. Writing exercises make the humanist skilled in his subject, and virtue allows the virtuoso to shine. In the midst of a subjectivity excluded through regression into itself, the practicing discover a distant coast within themselves, the promise of an unknown world. More than 100 years before the actual continent, a symbolic America appeared on the horizon. Its coast is the place where the practicing of modernity set foot in the small world of themselves. Hence, what Jacob Burckhardt, following the trail of Michelet, had presented as the formula for the Renaissance, the discovery of the world and man, was initially, seemingly paradoxically, an inner world event. It led to the discovery of the world in humans, or rather the discovery of the human being a model of the world, a microcosmic abbreviation of the universe. Friedrich Hebel still had a notion of this phrase when he noted in his journal, quote, "Great men are humanity's tables of contents." End quote. The secret of the humane ability to be whole would no longer be confounded on the biblically certified image. No longer be founded on the biblically certified image of God. It pointed equally to the image of the world, which makes suffering, active and contemplative humans view themselves as universal mirrors and cosmic oracles. This launched the train that would not stop until it arrived at the Baroque equation of God and nature, with the human being as a copula and living sign of equality. For the subject in the modern age, this meant that it had to understand itself as a reality-hungry potential. From that point on, being human meant running oneself as a workshop for self-realization. Homo mirabile. The reinterpretation of the human potency for totality transformed escapism, flight from the world, into the most world-filled mode of being thus far encountered by the individuals of our cultural area. The enrichment of withdrawal into a life form that displays no less wealth or diversity than extroverted existence produces the unlimitedly cultivatable self-structure addressed with the anthropological catchword of the modern age: personality. Modern personalities. These are the microcosmic works of the art of living that result from the time-honoured position of recessive self-formation. Except no longer in the spirit of monastic humilitas, or the mystical art of dying, but rather driven by an encyclopedic artistic dynamic that leads to interminable virtuosities and virtualities, jaw-dropping results of an inward extroversion. The imperative, "you must change your life," now implies taking oneself in hand and moulding one's own existence into an object of admiration. Where humans themselves are meant to become the mirabile, the living artificia admired by those around them, and that means far more than respect, love, or sympathy, they cannot remain in their escapist retreat forever. One day they must go on the stage and turn their inward performance into an outward one. Petrarch was forced to leave his refuge when he was crowned poet laureate on the Capitoline Hill in Rome on 6th of April 1341, a key date in the history of modern fame. Much of what conventional Renaissance scholars have produced to document the modern individual depended on the outing of the intelligent human being in the new forums of admiration. It is not without reason that Burckhardt had already emphasized the correlation of fame and culture of individuality as a characteristic of the era. What has more recently been termed the archive was initially no more than a collecting point for fame and the famous in the cultural memory, a function that, for reasons yet to be established, had to come under the control of the modern state, or more precisely, the semantic state banks, museums, and major libraries, whose duty it is to look after the balance of meanings and quote-unquote cultural values. What seems like a Vanity Fair is in truth the state treasury of prestige and excellence, the nucleus of a new economy based on the creation of cultural value. The fact that these secular collections challenge the status of the Church's salvific treasury testifies to the attractiveness of this new system of value. We recall, in the sphere of monastic anthropotechnic forms, the monks worked on transforming themselves into the status of a monk. The exemplary sculpture of servient obedience, whose legend was incurvatus et humilitatus sum, evidence of the effects of the Holy Spirit on human material. Under divine observation, the angels after all pass on all information upwards, and monastic supervision, the abbot acknowledges all of his flock's movements. The spiritually practicing sought to become like the archetype of their modus vivendi, the suffering God-man. The complete transformation into the saint admittedly requires the intervention of the world above, which is why it is only permissible to admire the miracle which breaks through earthly regularities. Only the beyond was empowered to break the transfigured human, a certification from above. Only the beyond was empowered to grant the transfigured human a certification from above. The rules are entirely different in the sphere of courtly, humanistic and artistic anthropotechnics, to say nothing of the mass media, neo-athletic and biotechnical age. They stand under the sign of the man-made wonderful, mirabile, which no longer addresses faith, but rather educated artistic taste. They appeal to a second-degree faith that expresses itself as an expertise in mastered unbelievabilities. Modern quote-unquote culture came about when the appreciation of miracles gave way to an appreciation of the miraculous. As one can easily see, this culture could no longer be a matter for saints and the silent, who interpret all higher things as signs from the world above. The turn towards the wonderful marked the debut of a society of the spectacle, which Guy Debord mistakenly dated to the 20th century. It extends back into the late Middle Ages, when virtuosos stepped out of the shadows of the saints. The golden age of admiration for art continued for as long as the willingness to be astonished applied equally to works of art and art-creating humans. Presumably opera is the last art form today in which sublime confusion has survived. Every festival summer proves that there is still a disposition towards honouring singing goddesses and listening to the acuity of tenors as if they were sonorous proofs of God. The modern type of virtuosity came from the invitation to encounter the man-made mirabile. It was the appeal to the welcome confounding of art and life, and the equally welcome mingling of heroes, saints, and artists. Now, knowledge of human nature was only possible as insight into the complexities of the strategically folded and artistically heightened life. Humans are structurally superior to themselves, and carry within them an asymmetry in which they mould and are moulded. These two insights, consolidated in the course of the modern centuries, revealed an eccentric potential in humans that could no longer be attributed to the coarse facts of the political domination of man by man, to recall the tired formula of the Saint Simonists. In the course of anthropological enlightenment, it became clear just how far every individual was caught up in vertical tensions and hierarchical effects of an apolitical type. If existence means the personal realization of chances at ability, then everyone is always already on a ladder of more or less, where they position themselves through the results of their own efforts, and cannot dismiss those ahead of them as oppressors. Now the individual seems more like a trainer who oversees the selection of talents and drives the team of his habits. Whether one calls this micropolitics, the art of living, self-design, or empowerment, is purely a matter of taste. Homo anthropologicus. The unstoppable growth of the knowledge of human nature into the theory of the artist can be taken to explain the tendency towards anthropology that has formed the manifest centre of modern philosophical activity since the 18th century. The phenomenon of anthropology indicates and declares technical explication has brought about a situation in which humans must be explained to humans again from scratch. It is no longer enough to be a human as one was supposedly spawned by nature. The dream of simple self-foundation via the origin is over. The first edition of humanity is now only of ethnological interest. Rousseau's idyllic excursions were powerless to change this. An even weightier factor is that the methods known since antiquity for ascetic revolt against the old Adam is in us, who is ruled by habits, passions, and mental inertias, and the boosts in being human through religious, philosophical, and athletic exercises are no longer adequate. The spiritually interested of our time should acknowledge that the great teachers of mankind, from Lao Tzu to Gautama Buddha, from Plato to Jesus, and why not also Muhammad, are strictly speaking no longer our contemporaries. In anthropological explication, humans come into a morally and epistemologically ecstatic, Plessner calls it eccentric, position towards themselves. A more precise description of this position yields the picture of an ontological hybrid. It shows a theatre director who has been condemned to a practicing self-reference from early on, and now faces the task of realizing the script of their own existence on stage and observing how others observe them. One can now say it explicitly. In Homo Artista, the agent and the observer merge to form a single dynamic dual. The early ascetics had already elucidated these conditions. Modernity sought to make the corresponding insights binding in its discursive style, and with technical accessories. Henceforth it was resolved no one could be human without simultaneously being an anthropologist, indeed an anthropotechnician. This title is bestowed on those who take responsibility for their form and appearance. In the late 20th century, the translation of the anthropological axiom that humans do not simply live, but must lead their lives, was the medially ubiquitous call to turn one's own self into a project, and the project into a business, including self-bankruptcy management. At the first climax of the great subjective armament cycle in Balthazar Gracian's pocket oracle, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, the most astute training manual for men of the world, published under a pseudonym in 1647, the author was still able to put forward a comprehensive maxim for life in the book's final paragraph. Quote, "In one word, be a saint. Virtue is the link of all perfections, the centre of all the felicities. She makes a person prudent, discreet, sagacious, cautious, wise, courageous, thoughtful, trustworthy, happy, honoured, truthful, and a universal hero." End quote. One would be hard-pressed to find a passage in the literature of modernity where the phrase "be a saint" is used in as artfully misleading a fashion as here. What is called a saint here is the mask worn by the returned sage of Stoic provenance, who is himself a cover for the yet uncomprehended modern human, the virtuoso, the success artist, the entrepreneur, in fact the epitome of the man and woman with far-reaching intentions and complex ulterior motives. In the age of the one-person company, it is perhaps interesting to remind ourselves that what we think of today as fitness could be recommended as saintliness in early modernity. The first sentence of The Art of Worldly Wisdom gives a clearer sense of the true quality of the new personality structure than the last. Quote, "Everything is at its peak of perfection. This is especially true of the art of making one's way in the world. There is more required nowadays to make a single wise person than formerly to make the 7 sages of ancient Greece. And more is needed nowadays to deal with a single person than was required with a whole people in former times." End quote.